When you close your eyes and picture the American West, what do you see?
All right, Cowgirl, you halfway there.
The term cowgirl means so much more than riding horses and being on a ranch.
I think it's a mindset. I think it's an approach to keep powering forward with one foot in front of the other.
The West makes up so many different people now. We realize we're all one. The West can be one.
Hi everyone, welcome to this new episode of Carolyn Talks. I'm your host, film critic and journalist Carolyn Hines, and this is the podcast / YouTube channel where I speak to film creators around the world about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I'm very happy to be joined by filmmaker Razieme Iborra to talk about her film, How the West Was Won. Not W-O-N, but O-N-E, which I thought was actually a really cute name and a really smart way to play on the phrase, How the West Was Won, talking about basically the settling of homesteaders in the Western Front, as it would have been called back then. So I like that you named the film that and you changed the connotation of it. So it's basically it's following three young women: Elle, who is from Miami, Florida; Annie from Queens, New York; and Morgan from Livermore, California. And it's about basically their ideas of what being a cowgirl is like. And for each of them, it's very different, but they kind of all come to converge at the end to having the same idea of what being a cowgirl represents in American West and in American culture. So I'm very happy to have Razieme to talk to me today. Yay!
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So I usually like to start off by asking my filmmakers a bit about what got them involved in filmmaking. So for you, how did you become involved with filmmaking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've always been a really creative person from the time I was very, very young. For a while, I really wanted to be an author. And that was like, when I was like 6, 7, I wanted to be an author. I think what really changed for me is when The Dark Knight came out, which I went to film school at NYU. And I think when I would talk to my peers about, the movie that got us into movies, it was like a cultural reset, The Dark Knight, for like people in my age range who want to make films.
Yeah.
But it really, I was 12 when it came out, and
Oh my God.
I know, right? And
heart.
And I grew up in this like small town in Ohio, and going to the movies was not like an invigorating experience. It was a pastime. It was something that people just kind of did. And there wasn't ever an experience that I had in the theater like I had watching The Dark Knight, where a film really seemed to grip the audience, and all of their reactions were like, hitting the nail on the head. You could tell that there was such intention in Chris Nolan's directing between what he intended the audience to feel and what we physically felt in the audience. And like I said, I was very young and taken just by the experience that I was having in this theater with everyone else, when movies really weren't like that, like in my small town. So it was a moment for me. And for a while I wanted to act. Actually, I really, really fell in love with Heath Ledger, as everyone did. And the more I learned, as a really young kid, more about the film industry and how films are made, the less I wanted to act and the more I wanted to direct. So that's really where it came from for me.
And so for this film, I guess like as soon as I like to draw like comparisons between like a filmmaker's film and their journey to be filmmaking. And hearing you speak, like the film itself, How the West Was Won, there's a very something that really that becomes evident at the beginning of the film, how for each of the three ladies, the time that you follow them, they each have to have a very specific moment of like self-actualization and self-realization about what they wanted to do with their lives. Like they all started out with a very definite idea of what they wanted to be. Like for Morgan, she wanted to be, her ultimate goal at that time was to be Miss Rodeo America. And for Annie, she wanted to be a filmmaker, and like her ultimate goal was to reach LA. And for Elle, she started out as a fashion designer, and then she was working with python skins and making accessories, but then she realized, oh wait, I actually wanted to study ecology of conservation. So for for each of these three young women, the film is about them realizing what path in their life they wanted to take. And for you, like there was a defining moment in your life where you decided, I want to work in film, but wait, I don't want to be an actor. I want to be a filmmaker. So with having that kind of similarity with these young women in the film, is that what drew you to making a film about three young women at such a pivotal point in their lives?
So much so. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. You know, everything that I'm drawn to as a filmmaker, the films that I like to make, whether it be, this is my first feature as a documentary. I've made narrative shorts in the past, but everything I've made to this point and everything that I'm developing for the future really kind of circles around this idea of personal identity. You know, who am I? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to become? I think it was always, you know, something that was like at the forefront of my mind growing up. I mentioned I grew up in a small town in Ohio. And I really never felt like I had a sense of home there. I never really felt like I fit in. From a young age, I wanted to go make movies. I wanted to go to New York. I did, you know, for school, but I was very, very vocal about like wanting to get out of the small town and like live big dreams. And a lot of the people, even young kids that I went to school with, it's really like the town I grew up in has a very small town mentality. Where people are really content and happy to, and you know, if that's the kind of life people want to live, power to them, but they're very content and happy to like have a family from a young age, raise kids, stay in the town, and have like a very kind of American life, like a typical American dream, right? A nuclear family. And, you know, I wanted to run off and like be this crazy artist. So there was always this question growing up for me of who am I? You know, what is my identity? Why don't I fit in here? You know, do I fit in somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that stories surrounding those themes really, really speak to me personally, speak to me on a deep level, and always kind of draw me in.
And I relate to that a lot because I'm from the Caribbean, but I think there's something that a lot of people outside the Caribbean don't realize is that for us, living on an island is essentially the same way. Yeah, but it's a bit different. It's a bit more different because it's a bit more contained. Because at least living on a continent like on like North America or South America or across the world, you escaping means like you just like traveling cross country. For us, escaping means literally traveling to a completely different country. And for us on the island, our lives there's literally a limit to how far you can go because there's a limited amount of jobs. Like the job opportunities are not infinite, you know, in the sense like the way they are here, and like. We're brought up to think, oh, get married, have kids, you know, and even if you don't get married, still have kids. And then like, okay, you stay in a job, you stay in that job forever, you know, like you get a government job, you got that government security, you get your pension and you're set. And like, there's really no, we're not taught in a way to like dream bigger than that, you know, right, and like, and so like, I kind of relate to that because then that's something I think a lot of people, I always say a lot of people outside of the Caribbean don't really understand that. We understand that having that be experiencing that small town experience, and the film is very much like that. And I think for both Elle and Annie, that's what it's about because they moved across the country. Like, and I thought Elle was interesting because she's originally from Florida and she would study fashion in New York, and then she moved back to Florida. Whereas Annie, she moved from New York to Florida to LA. But she kind of has a similar trajectory to Elle because her parents are immigrants. And I noticed Annie doesn't say where her parents are from. And I wanted to ask you if you knew.
Haiti.
Okay. Because I was wondering, like, she has like her parents are immigrants, but she doesn't name where their parents are from. But she kind of has the same thing where because her family moved from Haiti and from the Caribbean, so because they wanted to leave to find a better life for their children. For a lot of immigrants, like moving away is a like part of that, you know, like we want to give our children more opportunities because not only because of what's happening in Haiti politically, but it's an island, you know, there's only so many places and opportunities affordable to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for you, and so in your discussions with Annie in particular, I want to start with her, like what kind of conversations did you have with her? Because unlike Morgan and Elle, Annie is younger, but she was starting at a point in time where she's graduating from college. And she's graduating from college at a time where COVID lockdown was still happening and people were still social distancing, and she was in a graduating class who had to do everything virtually. So talk to me about her and finding her and the discussions that you guys had with her becoming involved in the film, but also her days as a filmmaker working with you in a film that's basically watching her journey of self-discovery as a student at such a like tumultuous time, I think, in like global history.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I first learned about Annie. We had a mutual friend who's a DP who works a lot with her, shoots her stuff, and he's a guy in New York, and I was friends with him, and so I started to see posts on social media when they would work together, and I thought her work was so cool and really impressive. And I remember like going to her page and just thinking, wow, like this girl's super self-expressive, like very, very cool, gorgeous girl also. And I just gave her a follow. I just gave her a follow.
Wait, where did that come from? Is that Melody?
It never occurs when you want it to occur. It
I've
always
never seen that happen.
Oh my gosh, yeah. If you put up like a 2, I don't know if it'll happen, but if you put up like a 2, yeah, balloons.
Is that a setting? Like we're digressing here, but I've never seen. I didn't even know that was possible with Zoom.
I would so love to turn it off. It always happens in therapy. And I'm like, it's not the time, I would love to turn it off. I don't know how. But anyways, yeah, so I just followed Annie on social media, and like a year went by and not much happened. And then around 2019, like Old Town Road was super popular, and Lil Nas X, and we saw all these creatives of color really kind of stepping into like these Western iconography, like aesthetics, like putting on a lot of Western wear, wearing horses, goodness, riding horses. We really saw people of color like stepping into the cowboy and cowgirl identity. Meg Thee Stallion became really popular. Solange had dropped her album that year, When I Get Home, which is gorgeous and brilliant. I don't know if that had originally influenced Annie, but around that time, I remember on social media, I saw her like posting photos of herself in cowboy hats and denim and cow print. And I was like, wow, like, I wonder if this person, wants to explore any of this. And around the same time, like I had started to develop like the very beginnings of how the West was won. And I was doing a lot of research because of how popular Old Town Road became. I was doing a lot of research on Black cowboys. I grew up riding. I don't come from a horsey family, but I was like a horse crazy girl. I was a horse girl when I was young, and like begged my parents for lessons and begged my parents for a horse and da 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 da. So, I've been around that world since I was 7. I've been very, very active in it. It's a massive part of my life now. I have 2 horses now, blah, blah, blah. Sidebar. So because of this, like because of growing up riding, I was really, really struck when Old Town Road became popular, and I saw all these people of color like on horseback. I was struck that it struck me, because I started to question, as someone who's grown up riding and been around this world, why haven't I seen this? Why is this still an unfamiliar image to me? So I started doing all this research on Black cowboys. I met Larry Callis from the Black Cowboy Museum outside of Houston, Texas. He appears in the film. He's wonderful. And so, all of these ideas were kind of swirling around my head at this time as I saw Annie on social media posting these images of herself. So I reached out to her and I was like, hey, I've noticed this. I've been learning all this stuff. I'm kind of developing a project, would you like to get involved? And she was like, hell yeah. So that's how Annie kind of came on board. And, it was kind of like your typical documentary. Again, this is my first documentary, but it's how I've always, heard about docs being described in the very beginning. Kind of know what you want to talk about, but you really are in a very exploratory place and you don't know what direction it's going to go in. And having conversations with Annie as a filmmaker herself was wonderful and like so informative for her story. I think her story, in comparison to the other girls, reads as like slightly more poetic and slightly more like a storyteller than the other 2 girls, and very ethereal, kind of surreal as well. And that's just her. Like that's so much of her that she brought to the process and brought to the project. And we could sit down, as filmmakers, both of us. She does a lot of work in the commercial and branded music video space. She did a short film for Hulu that premiered on Craig Robertson show on Hulu. So Annie's a wonderful filmmaker in her own right. And it was really, really cool to like make that part of our process together, to sit down and be like, all right, like, I would tell her, all right, this is, kind of how your story is being crafted. Like, what do you think might be informative for this? And she would come up with like really cool ideas herself as a filmmaker. that, you know, we ended up putting in.
Yeah, her sections of the film are different. Each of them, each of the sections for Elle, Morgan, and Annie are very different. Like it suits their individual personalities. And for me, I could tell that you really paid attention to who they are as people and how their lives influence the way they speak and the way they see things, because each section is very much them. You know, like the lighting for them is very different. Like I noticed the lighting for Morgan's segments are very much more open and bright because she lives on like a ranch, you know, and like that life that she's living as a rodeo girl is very open and vast. And like for Al's segments, because she's in Florida, like the lighting is a bit more soft and muted, because like Florida, that part of the Florida in the Everglades where she lives is more like it has this more of like a hazy look, because you have like the mist and atmosphere of the water and everything. So like that really informs the way her segments look. And Morgan's has a bit more of a slightly more cinematic look to it. Like you can tell that you use different lenses. I was wondering if you use different lenses, because like there's also a segment where she's like having a slightly surrealistic moment where she's like napping and then there's a horse. I'm like, why is she envisioning a horse? And that's the only part of the film that's like that. But as you were talking, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense that you would do it, because that's who she is. You know, like she's a very visual person and a very imaginative person as a filmmaker. And like you as the filmmaker working with her, like you make sure that those aspects of her personality and the way she looks at life comes through in the film itself. Like you make sure that you give each of them their own identity within the film visually.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, thank you for noticing. That definitely was important to me. I was trying to think of, you know, how can we craft like each of these girls' worlds so that it feels, you know, cohesive as a whole, but slightly different as well, to really kind of show the personalities, as you said, like of each girl. So it was something I was mindful of as we were shooting. We didn't quite use different lenses per subject, but sometimes we shot on two main cameras, one the Blackmagic Pocket 6K. That was the majority of the film. And we shot on 2 Sigma zoom lenses, super, super small, like very mobile little setup, which I think was important because we were in areas where I needed a lot of access. Like we were at the in gate at rodeos with Morgan, or, you know, I was on horseback, like for one scene with each girl. So, you know, having like a big rig on me or on a different operator would have not been feasible. You know, we needed something small, et cetera, et cetera. So that was our main camera. But we also used the Razieme with, I believe they were all Zeiss primes, with the exception of 2 like Alexas for a few shots, but not many. So I'll just
Are
say
those the shots where you're kind of like you kind of zoom in, it has that kind of grainy, more old school documentary look to them, you know, like they have like the grainy, like old, like, you know what I mean? Like there's a few scenes like that.
There were also like we used supplementary footage from an old it's an 8mm camera. It's a Canon 514. So it's real 8mm. It's not like a digital filter, it's real film. And then also VHS, which we shot, you know, with a VHS, like an old school 90s VHS
Good old
camera.
VHS.
Yeah, that then we digitized. So that also like wasn't a filter, it's actual VHS that's scanned in. But yeah, that was like our supplementary footage. The 8mm we tried to use for things that felt dreamy, and VHS we tried to use for things that felt like a memory. So that was kind of it bends, that rule gets bent a little bit, but that was like our ground rule for the use of those 2 formats. And then most of the time that we use the Razieme with like those more cinematic, like bloomier lenses, were also for more like staged or more surreal sequences. So for example, the horse in the hotel room was the Amira with like those lenses to lend itself to something that's more surreal, or, you know, you're questioning if it actually happened or if it's in the girls' heads. Another sequence that we used that camera and those lenses was towards the end, when Morgan is at the coronation ceremony for Miss Rodeo America. And there's this dreamy moment where she is like envisioning herself doing her own pageant walk. And it's very like glittery and bloomy. You know, that was also the Amira. So yeah, we tried to be intentional as possible with those camera choices, like the choice in tools and formats. I think with documentaries, sometimes it's difficult because, you get like out there in the field or on the ground and you're shooting, and you kind of have to piece things together later. But that intentionality, I come from a more scripted background. So that intentionality was something that was really important to me as we made this film.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it because it really, to me anyway, kind of makes you really focus on them and makes them more memorable. Like to me, it makes the scenes more memorable and makes the what's being discussed more memorable. Like Elle, she's very intriguing to me because she does such a full 180. And I think that's not only because she's older, because she's slightly more older than the other two, but also because she has a really unexpected life trajectory for her. For instance, as I said, she started out in New York and she went back home to Florida to help her dad with catching the pythons, because Florida has a severe issue with invasive species, and ball pythons are one of them, because people would bring them in illegally and not be able to look after them and then release them into the wild. And in case you didn't know, snakes, when they breed and hatch, they hatch a lot of eggs and they reproduce very quickly, right? So, and they have no natural predators except for maybe gators, but if they're released in a place where there's no gators, they're going to flourish. And because of that, like Florida has like these, and I remember I watched there's a few other documentaries that I've watched about that. And there was also a show about it, a comedy, I think it lasted one season, that was kind of parodying it, where people are basically hired by the government to be basically conservationists and to hunt them. And her dad is one of them, but he had all these skins and he didn't know what to do with it. And so she's like, okay, I'll help you. And then she's like, oh, I can maybe make accessories with these. And she's interesting to me because she starts out with hunting the snakes, and then she starts out doing fashioning accessories and doing work with that. But then I love that she started to make the connections between sustainability and ecology, because she started to really put herself in the position, I want to be a fashion designer, but what is the ramifications of me personally being a fashion designer? She's like, what is my imprint on the world going to be? And she starts to look at that and she starts to realize, wait, am I contributing to waste? Am I contributing to the destruction of the ecology? And she goes back to school to study ecology and conservation. And that's interesting to me because out of the three, she's the one that really makes the connection between work and life and nature, and being a cowgirl, working in that industry is very much relies on nature. It very much relies on conservation, but she's looking at it from, I think, a very more long-term perspective. So talk to me about finding Elle and then watching her go through this particular life, this journey, because it's something that a lot of people are talking about now, especially with regards to fast fashion, and like she references Ghana, like Ghana's beaches are being like overrun with fast fashion waste from North America in particular. Like, there's places in the Middle East, and she mentions another place, but it's in I think in the Andes Mountains, and you can even find them in like all across South Asia, like in India, there's garbage dumps just full of fast fashion wear. And she references that. And I'm like, watching at the beginning of this film, you would have never imagined that this film would have had segments talking about conservation and like the impacts of fast fashion on a global scale. So talk to me about her and like realizing where she was going with her journey and how you would end up making a film talking about conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Elle and I first met when we were both in college. She was studying fashion design at Pratt in Brooklyn.
Oh, so you've known her for a while.
Yeah, she's the first of the three subjects that I met physically. And we've been friends for a while. So this was back in like 2018 we met. She was studying fashion, I was studying film at NYU, and we met through a mutual friend. There was like a friend I had in the film program that was roommates with Elle. And again, I saw her on social media. I saw her on Instagram. She is, for those who haven't seen the film, she's gorgeous. And I was like, wow, she has such a unique look to her, like, all these tattoos and a very expressive style as well. Same with Annie. I think I'm definitely drawn to like kind of maximalist, like very expressive people. And so I reached out to her and I cast her in a very small, like little role in my student thesis film because I just thought she looked so amazing. And she killed it. And we kept in touch after that. She moved back to Florida after school. and we kept in touch that whole time. I was aware, since we were friends, I was aware when she started this work with the pythons. So yeah, it's the invasive Burmese python. They are completely destructive over Florida's ecosystem. And from the moment she started, making pieces out of the skins from the snakes she'd hunt, I just thought it was like the most fascinating process, and something that, I'd never seen. And I would tell her, even like, this was maybe at this point, 2019, late 2018, early 2019, I would tell her like, Elle, like, this is so interesting. And this is so like in left field. Most people would never, ever learn about or see or be privy to a process like this. I know it's your everyday, but this is so interesting to other people. She was like, yeah, and then as again, Old Town Road became popular, and I started, thinking about cowboys, cowgirls, that identity, who gets to step into that, what does it mean to be a cowboy or a cowgirl? I thought back to Elle, and I was like, well, this hunting like process that she's engaging in is super cowgirl. It's just not what you would think of. She wears cowboy boots, is traipsing around like in the wild, harnessing nature, doing something with it. It's like a different kind of frontier. She's wrangling snakes instead of cows or horses. But I was like, this is very, very cowgirl. And, even like the tradition of working with leather, and Elle makes bootstraps and belts and like things that actual ranchers or cowboys would need and wear. So, I saw the connection very clearly, and I reached back out to her and was like, I'm developing like a feature length version of this kind of identity or this idea, we're exploring this, and would you like to be a part of it? Do you feel connected to this kind of Western identity? And she's like, yes, absolutely, I'd love to explore what that means for me. So her journey, really started just about the snakes, just about her as a fashion designer. And in the years it took to make the film, it took 4 or 5 years. In that time, it really started where she was like, I want to do fashion, and I want to build a brand, and I want to like become like a creative director of my brand, and like, be a force in fashion. And while she still does want that, it was like a very clear, like, all right, we're starting here and we're watching someone build a brand. But in the process, as she began to work more and more and more with these snakes, and like go to different places, whether it be the ranch that we went to in the film, or excuse me, or different tours that she would do in the Everglades, or meet different snake hunters, or have conversations outside of the film that she's had in her own career, she definitely started to explore these ideas about conservation, and really started to think like, okay, like, I'm doing this, but this has so much more meaning than just going out into the Everglades, catching a snake, and making something out of its skin. And she really started to see, because she was having like firsthand experiences out there, talking to people, living this life, seeing the implications of her work. And so she really kind of started to look at herself, and started to look at what she was doing, and she was like, what does this mean? How am I either contributing to or helping solve a problem? And since the snakes are invasive, it does help to solve a problem. She's not wasting the materials. She's not just killing the snakes and disposing of them. They're becoming useful. And obviously, in growing her brand and selling her pieces, she's educating people as well, so that they understand these snakes are invasive, and that, we can help to contribute to solving an issue, and preserving an environment through this work, et cetera, et cetera. So, as a filmmaker, like, watching her make those realizations, and watching her make those decisions for herself and her future, going back to school, felt really, what's the word I want to use? Really like gratifying to me, because it felt like her story and her arc was really deepening. And it was something that, it's not like I puppeteered it or anything. It's something that organically happened in her life. And, as a filmmaker, I was like, wow, this really, like I said, deepens her story, and, makes it that much more impactful in the film.
Yeah, because as a fashion designer, she has a very rare opportunity that most fashion designers don't have, in that she's able to source the materials that she's working with directly with her hands. So she's very much aware of where they come from, and also the ecological ramifications of that. Whereas like for most in fashion designers, for instance, if they want to buy a bolt of material, they go to the like the factories where you would buy the materials in bulk or whatever, source them there. But they're not really, they don't really go to like the factories where these materials are actually made. You know, they don't really look at the full process. And then some, for many of them, they don't consider where they end up after they're bought and worn. You know, they're not taking into account, oh, okay, if I make this thing, like how long is it gonna wear? Like, is it gonna end up in a landfill? You know, and I'm like years, like I like, for instance, like we growing, I'm from the 80s, I'm an 80s baby. And when we would buy clothes, we would buy clothes with the intention of it lasting literally almost our entire lives. You know, I still have clothes if I can still fit in them, that I had from when I was a teenager and from my 20s, you know, because we bought clothes with the intention of saying, I'm gonna wear this thing until it falls apart. But now when you buy things and you're just like, I'm wearing it for this particular event. And like I'll probably never wear it again, because like one of the issues with fast fashion is how social media has influenced it. You know, like you buy something with the intent of posting on social media, and then you're like, oh wait, I can't wear this again because I posted on social media and hundreds of people saw me wear it, so I can't wear it again, which is absurd. Clothes are meant to be worn. And like, so like she talks about that. She talks about like where her clothes will end up, but then she also ties it into history, you know, and like she ties it into culture. Like she talks about, then she starts talking, this is where we're really going to get into the discussion of Cowgirls, like how it really made her think of her own heritage, you know, of her own Mexican heritage and Latin American heritage, and how that's where she started to really think of the idea of herself as a cowgirl, because oh wait, my people were the original cowboys of North America. You know, Mexicans, the vaqueros, were the original cowboys because they were taught by the gauchos who were from Spain, and you know, Mexico was colonized by Spain, and they brought the gaucho life to Mexico, who then taught it to like the American settlers, who like, you know, so like she really started to really touch into like how, wait, this is actually part of my heritage, you know, where she would have looked at it as being more of a white people thing. She's like, actually, no, this is part of my culture, part of my heritage, and I'm already making the accessories and the wear of this culture and heritage, like the boots, the belts, you know, the hats, and all this, and the chaps and all this stuff. And I loved how she was able to like really think of how all of these things encompasses who she is as a person, you know, how this thing that she never really thought about. In talking about conservation, I really made her think of how her heritage involves conservation, because the indigenous people always care more about conservation than the colonizers, you know. And so like that's, and I love that she was able to really, I think she, as the center of the film, really focuses on conservation and how conservation is a part of cowboy culture, you know, because that's where it started from. It started from like about conservation of the ecosystem at that time, and then once it became more commercialized, and once beef became more of this symbol of American prosperity and capitalism, it became less about conservation and just more about capitalism. But she kind of like pulls back in the whole idea of conservation into the film about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Elle is actually Cuban and Chilean.
Cuban, okay, but okay.
But she ties into, I think what you're talking about is she ties the history of Florida into her background, because, you know, obviously Florida was settled by Spain with the history that you mentioned. And Florida was it was the first state in the US to have cattle. So, you know, that's when she says, you know, cowboys, you could argue, were born in Florida. And I think also, I can't actually off the top of my head quite remember if this made it into the film, but I remember we had some extensive conversations like in voiceover, just, you know, interviews with Elle, where she talked a lot about Cuban values, because I think like the really rugged, you know, and being from the Caribbean and being from an island, I'm sure you can relate to parts of this, but I think a lot of the Cuban values were very much, you know, we want to find a better life for ourselves, and we're going to make that happen by whatever means necessary. And it was a very kind of grit your teeth and get it done mentality that I think Cubans really, really identify with. And she relates that a lot to a cowboy attitude, because it's virtually the same thing. You know, that get her done kind of mentality. I think it's pervasive across, you know, a Western identity here in the US and various other cultures as well. which just goes to feed into like the whole movie makes that claim, right? That like being a cowgirl or being a cowboy is an attitude. It's not necessarily where you're from or what your background is, what you look like, what your skin color is. It's really how you go about living your life, and standing up for what you believe in and having that kind of go-getter attitude. So yeah, but I think either way, like she really does feel like that heritage is present within her. And she talks a lot about her grandpa too, who when he came to America, he was really fascinated and like taken by these like symbols of America, cowboys and like motorcycles and leather and blah, blah, blah. And that was like the Marlboro Man. And that was definitely a big impact on Elle, like as a young girl. And as she was growing up, she's like that. Yeah, she says that's the first kind of cowboy she remembers is the Marlboro Man from her grandpa, because he used to smoke Marlboro Reds. And what was the latter part of your question? Remind me.
So like I was, well, first, you saying that she's Chilean and Cuban makes sense now, because I was watching a film I was watching outside and my sister's there, and I was trying to puzzle her accent, and I'm like, she has a very unique accent. And I was like, I can hear a bit of the New York and I can hear a bit of the Florida, and I'm like, I'm hearing the Spanish but also Caribbeans, but the Cuban, saying that she's Cuban, I'm like, okay, no, that makes sense. Because I was like, her accent is kind of like, I'm hearing a Caribbean and a Spanish influence, but I couldn't quite pin it down because there's a Floridian and the New York in there. So okay, Cuban and Chilean makes sense. But the latter part was about how she basically is kind of like, I kind of see her as the linchpin of the film, because she brings all of the elements in together where she talks about the conservation, but also the history of like the origin and where like the cowboy culture came from. So I kind of like see her as kind of like the centerpiece of the film, because she brings all of these elements into together, I think, very neatly. And I think that's a credit to you. And did you also do the editing for the film?
So the edit process was really interesting, because we shot for a number of years. I did all the assemblies. So I would, get all the footage back, choose my selects, and we edited in Premiere, and we would color code our footage on a scale of 0 to 5. 0 was like gray and it was like a blooper. 1 was like, this is abysmal, never, ever, ever put it in the movie, and it was red. And then, up to 5, which was green, and it was like, we can't make the movie without this shot. So I would go through and color code everything, and then go through like our 3s and up and pull selects, the moments out of the shots that I liked. And then I would pretty much take those selects and rearrange them in like a chronological order, where I could see, this scene was da 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 da. And around, let me think, like around May, June of last year of 23, we brought on an editor, Lily Wild, who I loved to pieces, and she absolutely made the movie what it was, or what it is. And so I would bring her these assemblies, and then the edit process from that point forward was very intensive and very involved between the two of us. I edited a lot more than I thought I would. But there would be certain scenes where like, we would really try to figure something out, and like she would do a pass. I'm like, okay, like, I have an idea for this and it's hard for me to articulate. I was like, can I just take it back and edit it and I'll show it to you? And she was like, yeah. And so especially because of the speed, we wanted to be done by the end of last year, and we pretty much were. We did like our sound mix in January of this year. But we did finish on time. And in order to do that, I did take on like some of those editing responsibilities. So, I did the assemblies. There are a couple scenes, that I think I edited. Lily did the majority of it, and really brought like the story together. She was truly responsible for that. And I did like the cuts in the very, very beginning, in the intro and the end montage, because I don't know, I was really particular about them. So so we would, toss those back and forth and make changes and da 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 da. But I think when it came down to like the final cut, especially for that end montage, I did that. But it was a wonderfully collaborative edit process, and I really, really liked working that way.
No, yeah. So the way how like the story melds, and like how Elle kind of like brings all the stories together. A lot of that has to do with the editing. So there's a credit to you and to Lily how the editing works. And speaking about that, like for Morgan, she like, as I said, like at the beginning, like all 3 of these young women go through like very transformative moments in their life. And for her, she had this very particular idea where her biggest aspiration was to be Miss Rodeo America And then she's on the way to achieving that. She's preparing for the major competition. She's prepping, she's doing all this rehearsal, and then she gets sick. And where for her, she had to realize, oh, wait, do I want to sacrifice my health and potentially my life for this one moment? Like she's like, the competition is 8 days. Having the title is with the assumption that she's gonna win is only gonna last a year, but she's like, if I continue with the competition, if I do win, that could actually jeopardize my health because of the stress of it. And so for her, I kind of related to her in that particular sense, because I myself have had health issues where because of my health issues, I had to decide, is this career path that I'm on, is it going to be worth it? Is it going to be worth my health? Right. And so I really related to her to that. But also is also really interesting to see a young woman have this particular moment, because we generally, even if you look at fiction film, you generally don't get to see young women have these very particular transformative moments in their life. Usually it has to do with an external trauma, like for instance, if they're attacked or something that someone did to them or something that happened to other people, that's where we get to see young women on screen have these moments of clarity and transformation. But for her, hers came because of an internal situation, which because she got severely sick. And so it was interesting just from a cinematic perspective to see her go through that. And so for you, as a cinematographer, but also as the director and someone who's getting to know her, what was it like to see Morgan go through this particular transformation? Not because of she decided, I want to have a different life change, because for instance, with Elle, she saw the ecology and everything change, and she wanted to be more proactive about that. But for Morgan, it'd be because of a health scare, and what I'm seeing her in the hospital and watching her have to make this particular change, and she had to do it very quickly. She didn't have the chance to do it over a length of time like Annie and Elle. She had to make this in almost within the space of a few days. So what was it like for you to watch her go through that?
It was terrifying, and then heartbreaking, and then really inspiring. Because her trajectory is she, when she was still Miss Rodeo California, which we see in the film, she goes to the Miss Rodeo California pageant to crown her successor, which is the last thing that she has to do before she goes to compete for Miss Rodeo America. And she was at that pageant, which we see in the film. She got sick at that pageant because of something she ate around that time. And so, I physically, in real life, I saw her there. She said that she was feeling ill, but no one really thought anything of it. I drove back to LA. She drove back to Northern California. And in the days after, I just started to see her mom posting on Facebook, because we all friended each other, but I saw her mom posting on Facebook that she was in urgent care. I'm like, oh wow, she must be, actually sick, something's up. And then she's in the ER, and then they're talking about dialysis and kidney failure. And when she says in the film that she almost died, that's not an exaggeration. She did almost die, which was, as I'm sitting so far away from Northern California in my apartment here in LA, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what are we even going to do? I felt helpless, and powerless to help her do anything, because far away and aside from this project, at this point in time, we fell in love with Morgan. Morgan's one of the most genuine, wonderful people I've met in my life. And I couldn't imagine losing her. She's just one of those people that's such a ray of sunshine. I'm like, how could this terrible thing be happening to her? So it was terrifying at first. And then finally her health started to turn around. And I was in conversation with her mom, very last minute. She's like, Morgan's going to get discharged from the hospital tomorrow. So I drove overnight, through the night up there to make sure I was there, the moment she stepped out of the hospital. And even there's iPhone footage in the film from her time in the hospital, but the worst of it wasn't even captured because, and then it raised an ethical question for me as a filmmaker. I'm like, I'm not going to ask a mother to film the potential final days of her child. I just won't. I'm like, no film is worth that to me. So, the worst of Morgan in the hospital isn't even in the movie. Her last day in the hospital was filmed by her mom, and that's in the movie. So, it was a harrowing time, and then she gets out, and I'm you know, having conversations with her, I'm like, you know, what are you going to do about America? Because her whole story, her whole, you know, everything I've known about her since I met this person was all about competing for America. And she's like, you know, like, I can't, it's not worth it. I can't. And she talked a lot about, you know, privately with me or in conversations that didn't ultimately make it into the movie. She talked a lot about her faith. You know, she's a Christian woman, and that really got her through this period of time. And, you know, so quickly, like that day that she got out of the hospital, we had an interview where I'm like, you know, like, tell me how you're feeling about this. And even then, like the day she got out of the hospital, like the first thing she said is, I want to go, you know, in whatever capacity I can to the pageant just to support the other girls. There was like no period of time where she was like, oh, woe is me. This is so terrible for me. She immediately stood up for everybody else, which is so damn cowgirl of her. And just very inspiring and like I can't speak highly enough of Morgan. So then going to the pageant and seeing her show up for everyone else and like that round of applause that she receives from the crowd when she's there was just, it's such a testament to the person she is and really exemplifies her values like as a human being and as a cowgirl.
Yeah, and she's very inspiring because, as I said, she's young and she had to make such a very life-defining choice very quickly. And I think she handled it, people say she handled it with grace, but I think also maturity and clarity. You know, like she didn't hem and haw because she was like, yeah, nah, this isn't worth it. You know, like she knew that straight off the bat, because there's some people who would say, oh, and I still want to do it. And even if it puts me off the risk because this is important, she's like, no, this is not important enough. You know, like, because she was looking at, again, the long-term like Elle, she was thinking of the long-term consequences of her actions. And she's like, if I do this, it's just for a year. And then after a year, it's not really going to matter anymore. You know, she's like, I'm going to have a hat, but that's it. You know, she's like, I'm going to have a hat with a crown, but like, that's it. You know, and so and like it's a very brave choice for some people who never had to be put in that position where you had to weigh your health and your life against your aspirations. It is not an easy choice. And so like she gets respect for that, because she also has to realize that she had to also realize not only it has to do with like her mentorship, but her physical strength. She had to say, I'm just not physically well enough for this. And she didn't push herself through that, because she wasn't one of those people like, you know, you gotta like push yourself through these things to get to the other side. And she's like, it's not worth it. I'm personally of that opinion. I'm not about losing your body to prove a point to no one, because the people that you're trying to prove a point to at the end of the day, they're not going to be with you in your bedroom when you're lying down in pain, you know. So she had that clarity.
Absolutely, yeah. And I will say now, Morgan is thriving and she has the rest of her life to look forward to. She's married and she has 2 kids now. 2. Yeah. The youngest, who's a baby, like she just had this child like a month or 2 ago. And the baby was at our premiere, which was 2 days ago at Dances with Films here in Hollywood. And the child was in attendance at the premiere, which was adorable.
And so in having the opportunity to see her achieve one of her dreams, because at the beginning, one of the things she always mentioned was she always wanted to have children. What was it like for her watching the film and seeing herself go through that process on screen?
I think she is just a very stoic woman. And, you know, it was just her life. Like it wasn't really emotional for her. I will say for her parents, because we've had 2 screenings. One was just a private invite, like friends and family screening that Morgan and her dad were in attendance for. And then our premiere, you know, 2 days ago that her mom was in attendance for. And I think it was probably a more emotional experience for her parents, to be honest. But Morgan's just, you know, she's just a stoic, very strong person. And, you know, similar to like when she got sick, she just took it all in stride. And I don't think that watching it was any sort of like, whoa, for her. She's like, yeah, you know, that's me and that's my life. And like, that's honestly, you know, it's an honest depiction of the person I am.
I want to talk a bit now about the culture of cowboy. You mentioned like one of the things that inspired you into really considering the topic for the film is like Old Town Road by Lil Nas X and like Megan Thee Stallion, with her name being a reference to that. And then I thought it was interesting that you use those references, and then also Annie has the same references, like when she talks about when she talks about really becoming fascinated with Western culture as she started to travel across LA, it kind of made me think of how me from the Caribbean, I've always been exposed to Western culture because I grew up reading like Mills and Boon's books at an age where I had no business reading Mills and Boon's books. You know, I grew up, one of my all-time favorite movies is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is like I don't care what anyone says, that's like the best Western film ever. Like Tombstone. But then, and like in the Caribbean, like Western culture is actually very big. Like the island of St. Lucia has a very big Western culture because like they do farming there, and it kind of is influenced by North American stuff and ranching. And like you can go to like bars, and like there's Western themed bars where like you hear music by like Loretta Lynn and Reba McEntire, and like that's kind of big. Just I've always been exposed to it, but like for Annie, she wasn't exposed to it. So and then of course like unlike Morgan, who was born in that culture, Annie and Elle also share that commonality where they had to discover it over time. So like for you, like what was it like for you, like as you were researching for the film, having this discovery? And I have to actually mention in the film Nope, the 2022 film by Jordan Peele, he actually uses one of the pictures that Annie looks at. And there's a picture of a black cowboy, and it's actually referenced in the actual film itself. So what was it like for you going through the research and like deciding what you wanted to bring to the screen?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, like I said, I have a background writing, and you know, as I grew up writing, I did grow up like on the English side of things. I grew up in rural Ohio. I wrote English myself, but I was always surrounded by a lot of people who wrote Western. And so there was plenty of discovery for myself, like alongside the girls, which was really, really cool. And I think it continued to allow this kind of very exploratory tone to the film because I was exploring, you know, myself and my identity and the extension of the world that I was used to alongside all the girls, which was fascinating and really, really cool. I learned a lot about agriculture, specifically from Morgan. Fascinating. I have such a respect for agriculturalists and our farmers and ranchers. But yeah, I mean, I think that like Western culture really ever since Old Town Road, but especially now, especially with country music, I think it's having a complete renaissance, to steal Beyonce's phrase. I think it's really, really huge, and I think people are paying attention to it. And you know, my experience exploring this world, because oftentimes like cowboys and cowgirls and by extension ranchers and farmers and that whole side of, you know, America, is oftentimes really symbolic for America, right? Like, I think it's a unique, you know, the cowboy is so American. It's like a symbol of freedom, of the frontier, of struggle, of taming the West, of literally colonizing the country. And I think, say again.
I was like,
there goes again. Yeah. So I think like exploring this identity and exploring this way of life really was a way for me to explore how I felt about my country, like myself. I think that's true for the girls too, but I think exploring what it means to be a cowboy or a cowgirl is by extension exploring what it means to be American. And I think that the time we made the film in is a very divisive time. You know, we're coming off the tail end of the Trump administration through Biden's administration. Obviously very, very divisive. And the idea of coming together under a very American identity, I think for a lot of people is like a kind of, you know, tension-filled subject, because I think a lot of people are really disenchanted with the idea of what it means to be an American. And I was too, you know, especially when we started the film. I had just graduated. You know, NYU is a very, very liberal school. New York is a very liberal bubble. LA is a liberal bubble as well. And I think that I had a lot of expectations going into the film, going into largely conservative areas with rodeos or the South in Texas when we were shooting, you know, especially like when Annie and I were physically moving through Texas, moving through the South. We had a lot of ideas about, you know, like I understood that she was going to be like a Black woman with a cowboy hat on in Texas. And we had, you know, preconceived ideas of we were probably going to get gawked at, or like, you know, maybe someone would say something crass or mean or cruel to us or what have you. But to be honest with you, like those experiences never happened, literally not one. And I, you know, my like preconceived ideas of what I might run into in making this film literally never occurred. literally never. I was only welcomed by every community that we went to on both sides of the aisle, liberal or conservative. And everyone was excited about coming together under this Western identity. Everyone that we spoke to, especially in Texas, like really wanted people who otherwise would not take part in Western culture or like explore this part of the country or, care about farmers and ranchers. Like everyone was excited about the idea that we could all kind of get excited about something together and come together under, like I said, this identity. And I didn't run into a single person who said like, no, you can't wear that cowboy hat. No, you can't dress that way. No, you can't. No, you can't. No, you can't. It was always a very welcome, like open embrace. Everyone who was like traditionally from that way of life really wanted to open it up to everyone else. I can't speak for literally everyone who, is part of that way of life or everyone who loves country music or, anyone like I said, traditionally in that space. But in my personal lived experience, it was very, very welcoming. And I think it really turned a lot of my expectations on their heads and it allowed me to reevaluate my own relationship to my country and how I felt about being American. And it gave me some hope. It really did.
Yeah, and it does come through in the film, but something I wanted to ask you, because where I was wondering, how come you didn't have any references to Native American influence into the culture, into the cowboy culture and the Western culture? Because as like, for instance, the Vaqueros influenced the growth of the cowboy culture and Black people, the use of Black people within that space, because like the word cowboy comes from how Black men were referenced by the white cattle owners, and how actually Black people, their food is what influenced what the Texan food and what Western food is known as. Like you got the baked beans and all that stuff that came from both Black and also Latin American cultures, as well as Native American culture. I wanted to ask you about how come you didn't have any, like for instance, a representation of that within the film, like for another girl, for instance, from a Native American tribe.
Mm-hmm. I think that there are endless iterations of what it means to be a cowboy or a cowgirl or to take part in this space, like in American history. There are definitely many more iterations that we didn't, explore in the film. When I found the girls that I did, I wanted to really stay true to their own lived experiences. I think that especially because when we started making the film, as I kind of touched on in the last question, it started as like a much more politically driven kind of agenda-based film. And as we went about making it and I had these experiences that were very, very welcoming, it became a lot less agenda driven because I didn't want the girls to become a vehicle for personal politics. And because I had the girls that I had, I didn't want to use any of them, since they weren't Native, as a vehicle for that agenda. I wanted it to be very personal to these girls and, give value to them exploring their personhood and their womanhood without trying to like push anything on top of that. So, I would love to make like endless iterations of this movie with like every possible type of cowgirl. I personally didn't meet any. I wasn't fortunate enough to meet anyone at the time who was Native, but I really, really value, that perspective and that angle, that iteration of cowboy culture and Western history. And I think, any opportunity in the future to like bring that into the conversation, I would take instantaneously. I would love to continuously like have all these cowgirls contribute to the conversation. It didn't end up happening in this project, but maybe definitely in the future.
Yeah, maybe one day. Thank you so much for your time and for explaining the film and for making the film, because again, like we don't have many films about young women in America from this particular aspect, and for giving them also the time to explore themselves in the film, and then also exploring yourself and showing bits of American history that is not often considered in media. But thank you so much for making the film, and thank you. And I don't have them here, but I want to say thank you to each of the girls, to Elle, Morgan, and Annie, for working with the films, and much success to everyone. And thank you so much for talking with me. This was really fascinating, and it really did make me think again of like Western culture identity and how it's projected on screen for us, the audience, in ways that we don't often get to see. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and congratulations for the premiere. And But whatever film festivals you apply to, I hope you get in, and I hope to maybe one day see you at a film festival.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.